Hello, and thank you for launching this presentation entitled Addison and Steele New in Memory of Alexander Waugh, Episode 1. My name is Eric Luskow, and today is February 27th, 2025. I'll be approaching this topic from an Oxfordian perspective, i.e. that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was the author of the works of William Shakespeare, historically attributed to William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford. If you're not familiar with the Shakespeare Authorship Question and the Oxfordian theory, I would highly recommend you visit the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, for an overview. The title for this video is a tribute to Alexander Waugh, who tragically passed away last year after a battle with prostate cancer. We've been blessed with his outstanding scholarship in the Oxfordian cause and owe him a huge debt of gratitude for unlocking so many puzzles surrounding the Shakespeare Authorship Question. On Waugh's YouTube channel, there are 27 videos in the Who Knew playlist, all of them identifying contemporaneous or near contemporaneous authors who revealed their knowledge of Oxford as the author Shakespeare in quite ingenious and erudite ways. In this video, I will humbly follow in Waugh's footsteps and attempt to convince you that Joseph Addison and Richard Steele knew Oxford was the author and told us so in multiple essays from the Spectator. I'll be presenting one essay per episode in this series to keep the length of each under 30 minutes in respect of your valuable time. If you're not familiar with Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, they were early 18th century literary figures as well as politicos when the Whigs were in power. They are best remembered for the Spectator, a periodical which began publication in 1711 and ostensibly avoided politics or observations on individuals. At least that is what Addison and Steele regularly claimed. As they had recently lost their government positions, the nascent Spectator focused on literature, the theater, and manners, with only occasional veiled slips into politics and personalities. This is the very briefest of introductions. Obviously, there is quite a bit more to know about these two fascinating men, their lives, and their literary partnership. So, first question for us here. How would they have known? They were both well connected in English society. They were politicians, men of the theater, literary men, and likely Freemasons, though there are no records of their initiations. Steele is particularly interesting because he was raised from a young age by his aunt and uncle after both his parents died. Steele's uncle by marriage was Henry Gascoigne, who was the private secretary to the first Duke of Ormond. I'm unaware of any connection between George Gascoigne, who we know from 100 Sundry Flowers, and Henry Gascoigne, but it would be unsurprising if they were somehow related. The Duke of Ormond was in exile with Charles II during the years of the Protectorate, so Steele has that additional near-direct connection to the Stuarts. Addison also had aristocratic connections, as he was provided an income via the Whig lords Sussex and Halifax to produce political tracts on their behalf. The Freemason and royal connections seem the most likely sources of their authorship knowledge, but perhaps as literary men, they figured it out on their own, from the copious numbers of clues left behind by the author himself, as well as all the people Alexander Waugh has documented in his Who Knew series. The Spectator began publication in 1711, as I stated earlier. Essayists, primarily Addison and Steele, signed only with an initial, making them technically anonymous, but many knew who the authors were. Steele signed with an R for Richard, or T, presumably for the T in Steele for the most part, while Addison signed with the letters C, L, I, or O. Other authors also occasionally appeared, with Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift being the most notable. Later, when collected into book form, the essays were numbered, and subsequent edited editions usually identify the authors by name and sometimes helpfully added titles. Our first essay, authored by Steele, was dated Thursday, March 22nd, 1711, and numbered 19 in the subsequent book collections. The date has geometric meaning. 3 for March, plus 2 plus 2 plus 1 plus 7 plus 1 plus 1 equals 17, one of Oxford's geometric numbers adopted by him as the 17th Earl of Oxford. 40 for double V, with V's geometric value being 20, was his other number for those unfamiliar with Oxford and his geometric obsession. 19 also has geometric and Masonic significance as the number for the letter T, with the 3 T's forming the triple tau and the quaternary hidden in the ternary. If this sounds like gibberish, please watch Alexander Waugh's videos and it will all make sense. Another bit of gematria in this essay is in the first sentence. The 17th word is his, the 40th word is gentleman, the 51st word, 17 times 3, is secret, and the 57th word, 40 plus 17, is envious. So we get envy, gentleman, his secret, with a little rearranging of those words. The word envy is a homonym for the letters N and V, Ned Vere. The word appears frequently in reference to Shakespeare and de Vere. In fact, the very first line of Ben Jonson's To the Memory Encomium in the first folio is a play on the word envy and the letters NV. To draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name is literally correct. The letters N and V are not in the name Shakespeare, but they are the initials of Ned Vere. Stephanie Hopkins Hughes has an excellent article on her Politic Worm website concerning the letters NV and the word envy. Here's a particularly trenchant example of de Vere as NV from Gabriel Harvey. He refers to Euphues, John Lilly, as being the ape of envy, as Nash was the ape of Green and Green was the ape of Lilly. Notice how the use of the word mammoths, a doll or puppet, to describe Green, Nash, and Lilly, and his double use of yoke as an allusion to the ox in Oxford. Here's yet another piece of gematria. Steele emphasizes 3 heads of the envious man. He writes, consider the envious man with relation to these 3 heads, his pains, his reliefs, and his happiness. In gematria, P equals 15, R equals 17, and H equals 8, giving us 15 plus 17 plus 8 equals 40. The last bit of numerology in the Spectator essay we're looking at here is the line number of the quote from Horace. Unsurprisingly, it is 17. I promise there's no more gematria or numerology in the remainder of this video, but it's necessary evil when looking at these sorts of allusions to Oxford in his works or other people referencing him as the author. Another point here is that our essayist, in this case Steele, makes copious references to Francis Bacon and his essay of envy, which I suggest is a way to not so subtly shift the reader's mind back to the Elizabethan Jacobean era. In this slide, Steele identifies the object of envy, the prosperous man, which I would argue is a direct reference to our author in one of his many self-portrayals as Prospero. There may also be a hint to de Vere's Italian travels and subsequent obsession with Italy in his person and his works with the phrase goes abroad, but I won't insist on that allusion. Since we can't read the essay in its entirety here, I highly recommend you read the complete essay later to see the marvelous way Steele tells a multi-layered story. On the surface, we have somewhat of a rehash, though far more entertaining and less aphoristic, of Bacon's essay. But below the surface, Steele tells the story of the prosperous man, de Vere, full of youth, beauty, valor, and wisdom, contrasted with Will Prosper, the honest talebearer. Will Prosper, what a wonderful alias for Will Shakespeare. The adjective honest is loaded with meaning. Behind the primary meaning of trustworthy or true, we've seen how it was used ironically for Ben Jonson to suggest he was a dissembler, and it can also mean a dullard or a simpleton. Talebearer suggests what most Oxfordians believe. Shakespeare made his money as a front man for Oxford and disappeared from the London theater scene when his protector died. By the way, Will Prosper makes an appearance in the next essay, number 20, to assist Steele by standing on a hassock to stare back at an impudent rascal who rudely stares at women in church. A hassock is a footstool or cushion, but its original meaning was a firm clump of vegetation or grass, suggesting green here, and the French word for green is vert. And I do emphatically believe this fellow would make an excellent mute starer. Now we get to the crux of the essay. In 1711, the authorship of the Shakespeare works was attributed to an illiterate bumpkin. Anonymous and pseudonymous works of the Elizabethan era were misattributed to others, and the true author remained hidden behind a curtain. Oxford had, in the mores of his day, dishonored himself with theatrical activities beyond his prescribed role of producing anonymous history plays as propaganda to boost both the Tudor rule and allegiance to the state rather than to a Catholic or Protestant identity. He also associated too familiarly with the world of the public theater and had his works appear in print, intentionally with the two long poems, and sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, with the sonnets and plays. On top of this, he had been the fable of the world and a monstrous adversary with numerous personal scandals. Steele writes, "It is a matter of great consolation to an envious person when a man of known honor does a thing unworthy of himself, or when any action which was well executed upon better information appears so altered in its circumstances that the fame of it is divided among many, instead of being attributed to one." But something had changed recently. In 1709, Nicholas Rowe published his edition of Shakespeare's works, and the quote-unquote better information Steele noted was now indeed available. This edition was hugely popular and made Shakespeare in print far more accessible than it had been heretofore. More on Rowe shortly. Now Steele's subtext has shifted to anonymous authorship, attempts to discredit a purported author, and attempts to deny authorship. Steele writes, "I remember some years ago there came out an excellent poem without the name of the author." And then a little bit later, "They took great pains to suppress the opinion that it was his. That again failed." The next refuge was to say it was overlooked by one man and many pages wholly written by another. An honest fellow who sat among a cluster of them in debate on this subject cried out, "Gentlemen, if you are sure none of you yourselves had a hand in it, you are but where you were, whoever writ it." The crucial point here is that overlooked does not mean what it means now, i.e. missed, failed to notice, but rather overseen, reviewed, or revised. On the surface, Steele has changed his topic to an anonymous poet, but by immediately following the prosperous man and the honest talebearer with a story about an anonymous poem and an overlooker, is telling the reader exactly what had happened. There was a leader, a man in charge of the extraordinary explosion of literature during the Elizabethan Renaissance. Approaching the works of Shakespeare with the author misidentified has mired the correct historical interpretation of the genius of much of the output of this leader. Thus we get Hamlet, anonymous early plays that were supposedly nicked by the hardworking playwright from Stratford and reworked, misattributed early plays that don't fit the Stratfordian timeline, and so on. It's obvious when analyzing plays that have undergone later extensive revision, such as Hamlet or Lear, to recognize this authorial genius, but far more difficult when it's an early play like Titus Andronicus or a misattributed play like the Spanish Tragedy. From an Oxfordian perspective, we've been arguing for decades for the existence of a scriptorium with one man, Oxford, as its Caesar, if you will, that collapsed when Oxford went broke. Here in this essay, I believe Steele slyly reveals the truth. But hang on, who was Steele writing for? If it was for readers who already knew the author was Oxford, sometimes alone, sometimes with his secretaries, they would understand the allusions and the playfulness of Steele's essay, a knowing nod to fellow travelers. For those who didn't know, inevitably, as Steele writes, you are but where you were, whoever writ it. There's a third audience, though, the envious, those who knew the true author but continued to perpetrate the myth for personal and professional reasons. With Rowe's 1709 threadbare and occasionally apocryphal summary of what was known about the man from Stratford, Along with his overexuberant insistence on natural genius, it's not surprising that spirited debate occurred in the clubs and coffee houses. Today, Stratfordians are hopelessly mired in the same debate, the inevitable conflicts of the natural genius argument. The twain will never meet between literary analysis demonstrating the author's extensive knowledge of untranslated Greek, Latin, and Italian texts, the law, medicine, seamanship, Italian geography, English court intrigues, continental politics, etc., as opposed to the ridiculous pseudo-biographies that have been pawned off for centuries as plausible authorial origins, beginning with Rose. I highly recommend reading the first version of Rowe's Some Account and Samuel Monk's introduction, available on the Project Gutenberg site. Monk lays out a fascinating bibliographic history of Rowe's work, including, most importantly, I think, Alexander Pope's silent and consequential later editing of Rowe's biography. Rowe is an interesting case because his volumes all begin with an engraving by Michael Vandergook, so eloquently deciphered by Alexander Waugh in his YouTube video, George Virtue Knew, which contains the near ubiquitous 1740 messaging found in numerous other works and engravings. Rowe must have known what his engraver or engravers, if Waugh's theory that George Virtue, Vandergook's apprentice, was involved, was up to. What we have is a conflict of messages. The natural genius Stratford man of the introduction versus the Masonic geometric engraving pointing to De Vere. Are we really to believe Rowe did not understand the messaging in the engraving? In any event, Rowe had enough connections to become poet laureate in 1714 and was himself interred in Westminster Abbey, so I guess his dissembling on the authorship worked out for him. Rowe actually deserves his own Who Knew episode. Here's his 1742 Westminster Abbey monument with an epitaph composed by Alexander Pope, a close friend. The monument at one time was situated near the 1740 Shakespeare monument with Rowe's bust looking toward it, but was relocated at some point in the 1930s due to the discovery of an earlier painting on the wall behind it. That 1930s date of relocation is slightly suspicious, as Looney's 1920 book had instigated quite a bit of follow-up research by Looney himself, plus early Oxfordian luminaries B.M. Ward, Eva Turner Clark, Percy Allen, and G.H. Rendell, to name but four. Here's the original placement of Rowe's monument. You can partially see the Shakespeare monument to the left. And here's a close-up of Poe's inscription on Rowe's monument. There are 4 T's in the first line. Lines 1 and 2 contain 17 words. I've circled 4 T's spanning lines 4, 5, and 6. They share the same T. The word never, Ned Vere, in line 6, and 2 Veres spanning lines 4, 5, 6, and 7. So to argue Nicholas Rowe didn't know who Shakespeare really was would also mean arguing that Pope, his close friend, pulled an eternal fast one on him in composing his epitaph. Keep in mind, Pope misquoted Shakespeare on the Westminster Abbey monument to include his own 1740 messaging. So to be as clear and succinct as I can, I'm arguing here that Nicholas Rowe's biography of the Stratfordian Shakespeare, the first of its kind, was a deliberate fraud. It strains credulity to believe Rowe didn't comprehend the messaging of the frontispiece in his Shakespeare volumes, and that an epitaph loaded with 1740 messaging, composed by his friend Alexander Pope, would be engraved on his own Abbey monument, placed just across from Shakespeare's, without Rowe's prior permission. So this concludes episode 1. I hope I've argued persuasively here that in The Spectator, essay 19, The Envious Man, Steele revealed he knew Oxford was the author of the works attributed to Shakespeare and was having a go at his audience, whichever category, knowing, unknowing, or knowing and actively dissembling, they fell into. Please join me for episode 2, where we'll see how Joseph Addison approached the same subject. Thank you for watching episode 1 of Addison and Steele Knew in memory of Alexander Waugh.